I'm going to be speaking with everyone today about cattle futures, market manipulation, and then towards the end, I'm going to go a little bit into our case. Just a little background on me, very brief. I've been an attorney since '99, practicing primarily in the financial markets and doing a fair amount of work in the financial markets associated with agriculture and livestock products. And I'm just thrilled to be working with RCAF and representing all of you in our battle against the Big Four. I think that what is going on in your industry and in the futures market associated with what you do is something that has been a long time in the making, and it's frustrating as someone who's studied the futures markets for the last 20 years to see things decline to the point they have. So I'm hopeful that we're going to be able to do something good with the litigation, and really appreciate the support of RCAF. Like I said, the cattle litigation will be more towards the end, but everything I'm telling you leading up to that, I think is important and is part of it. And I know that a lot of you know about the futures markets. Many of you know way more about the futures markets probably than I do. And then some of you maybe not quite as much as others. So some of this might be a little elementary for some, but I'll hopefully keep it moving along, and you'll find it interesting nonetheless. And I'm also hopeful that in going over some of the broader concepts, you might see things that you've observed that will bring you to, that may allow you to bring some information to Bill or to us, so that we can further help the collective efforts. Okay, I see my next slide is on, and that's a disclaimer. And I'm an attorney, so I know you're all shocked, but I do have to give a disclaimer that the views I express in this presentation are my own personal views. They don't represent the views of my law firm, Cafferty, Clovis, Meriwether, and Sprengel, or RCAF, or any of the entities referenced in this presentation, or the other law firms with whom I'm working in the cattle litigation. And the presentation's for educational purposes. If you have specific legal questions, you should feel free to ask a lawyer of your own choosing. It doesn't have to be me, okay? All right, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, here's a roadmap. Like I said, I'll probably get through 10%, but I'm gonna start with just basics, futures, options, futures exchanges, then delve into cattle futures. I want to talk about the market structure and the players in the cattle futures market. And then item 4 there is the Commodity Exchange Act. And then we'll go into manipulation, the regulators, private litigation generally, tipping and whistleblowing. Then more specifically, I'll focus on the cattle antitrust litigation and how cattle futures play a role in that. And then if we have some time, I'm happy to take some questions. Okay. All right, what is a futures contract? The relatively universal definition is that it's an agreement traded on an organized exchange to buy or sell assets, especially commodities or shares of stock, at a fixed price, but to be delivered and paid for later. Paid for later, it could be a misnomer, because many futures contracts, you are credited and debited in your account the day you enter into the transaction. Next slide. Okay, for each futures contract, there's a buyer and a seller. So there's going to be a there's going to be a winner and a loser. The buyer has to take delivery of the underlying asset or commodity, and the seller has to make delivery at the agreed upon time. Futures contracts have contract months, so you might be entering into a contract to deliver cattle, 3 months in the future, 6 months in the future. The delivery price is set by the futures contract transaction. Parties in the marketplace agree on what they think is a fair price, or the price they have to live with, and they set that price, enter into the contract, are matched, and the price does not thereafter change. It stays the same. The only way for a buyer to get out of the futures contract is to sell an identical futures contract, and the only way for the seller to get out is to buy an identical futures contract. The buyers typically viewed as the long. They want prices to increase above where the futures contract price was set. so that they get something in the future that's worth more than the purchase price that they paid. And the short's just the opposite. They're hoping prices drop because they have to deliver it, and they're hoping they got a high sales price, and then they can go obtain the commodity or obtain an offsetting futures contract at a lower price and make a profit that way. Next slide. Okay, futures exchanges are very important. You're all familiar with forward contracts, and those are more, they can be bespoke, very tailored. They're off exchange, negotiated by the parties. Futures contracts are not negotiated by the parties. The only thing that's negotiated is the price that appears on the board. So you have a standardized quantity of the underlying commodity, for example, 40,000 pounds of cattle. You have standardized quality, can be, the grade of the cattle, the size of the cattle that make up that 40,000 pounds. You have a central marketplace and clearing. All the trades are supposed to take place on, in this case, the CME. We'll get into it later, but the CFTC and the regulators do not like off-exchange futures trading. It's illegal. Futures exchanges have to be registered. Futures contracts have to be approved by the regulators. You can have forward contracts that are off exchange, but not futures contracts. And then the exchange acts as a financial intermediary. So if you're a buyer of cattle and you're worried that the seller's not going to make good on delivery, well, you have an intermediary there, the CME, that will ensure that the seller lives up to its agreement. And conversely, if you're the seller and you're afraid that the buyer's not going to pay for the futures contract, the exchange acts as an intermediary and guarantees that the purchase price will be paid. Next slide. Okay, we also have options on futures, and there are call options and put options. And for each options contract, there's a buyer and the seller. And the purchase price of the options contract is sometimes referred to as premium. And that's why options contracts are also sometimes referred to as insurance. So let's focus on call options. That's the top row. The call option buyer has the right to buy the futures at a strike price at a set time. And the seller, if you look over, has the obligation to sell. So the buyer holds a right. They don't have to exercise their option. Whereas the seller, unless they get out of that options contract by purchasing an setting call option, they have the obligation to sell the futures contract at the strike price. The buyer pays the option price or premium. The seller receives the option price or premium. The buyer wants futures prices to rise above the strike price. The seller wants futures prices to fall below the strike price. The buyer, if those prices don't rise, the option's basically useless. They've locked in to buy, or they have the option to buy something at a price that's higher than what it's now worth or now valued in the market. So they'll let that option expire worthless and they'll lose the premium. The seller, if the prices don't rise above the strike price, are in a great position. They collect the premium. They know it's not going to be exercised. Put options are a little different. Much different, actually. The buyer has the right to sell the futures contract at the strike price. And at the set time, the seller pays the option, the put option buyer pays the option price or premium. They want futures prices to fall because they want to be able to sell in the future at the set price today. They want to be able to sell in the future something that's worth less than the set price today. And the seller is in a converse position. Okay, next slide. Okay, early agricultural futures exchanges. The first known one is the Dojima Rice Exchange. It was in Japan in 1730. There's an artist rendering of it. It looks nice and orderly, like there's no chaos there. Next slide. And then this is what happens inside the Dojima exchange. There are buyers and sellers, negotiating prices and, agreeing to delivery terms, et cetera. That's the earliest known one. There have been many other exchanges since then, and there probably were similar concepts, centralized marketplaces, going back even further. Next slide. In the United States, the agricultural and livestock exchanges were centered in Chicago historically. And as many of you know, we had the Chicago stockyards back in the 1800s and early 1900s, where producers would bring agriculture and livestock for delivery to processors. The Chicago Board of Trade, or CBOT, was formed in 1848, and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, or CME, was formed in 1898. Cattle futures contracts are historically a CME product, but now it doesn't matter, and I'll get to why. Next slide. Okay. Historically, as I mentioned when we were looking at the Japanese rice exchange, there was an open outcry pit. Individuals who had trading privileges or memberships would go into the pit. They would, yell at each other, signal with their hands, prices and quantities, and somehow out of all of that, there would be an efficient price created. The important feature of the open outcry pit is if you cheated, chances are people would know who you were, and they would take note of that, and that would affect how they traded with you in the future. There was also, I think, starting in the 70s and certainly by the 80s and 90s, video surveillance. So they could look for things like collusion and whispering and off or out of pit activity that might indicate some form of manipulation or collusion. Next slide. This is the open outcry pits today. There's nothing going on in them. I think the last open outcry pit in Chicago was closed. And now, next slide. Today, the CME has consolidated everything. It's the largest futures exchange in the world. They consolidated the old Chicago Mercantile Exchange, the old Chicago Board of Trade, NYMEX, and COMEX. All range of futures products are traded on the CME. They had $4.9 billion in revenue in 2021. They trade on average 3 billion contracts across all product lines per year. The notional value of those contracts is 1 quadrillion, and the CME makes most of its money off of transaction fees and licensing data to traders and trading firms and end users. Next slide. So today, everything is electronic trading. You may have heard of Globex. That's the CME's name for its electronic exchanges. Its electronic exchange. These servers are located outside of Chicago in Aurora. There are redundant servers elsewhere. And essentially, computers around the world, going from Montana, South Dakota, Iowa, Saudi Arabia, Japan, Europe, et cetera, they're all linked together, and they connect to the CME servers and matching engines in the Chicagoland area. With the advent of high-frequency traders, there are things called co-location, where if you pay the CME enough money, you can put your trading servers right next to the CME's matching engines and beat everybody to the better price. That's led to high-frequency trading. Some of you may be aware that some of the more sophisticated entities have built their own cable lines, taking old railroads or carving up mountains to get a direct line, cable line to the exchanges. They're also now using microwaves, et cetera. And the key feature is that the trading is anonymous. And the one picture I have is a trading floor of a single firm. So those are all traders that are trading different products. And then the picture to the right of that is, an individual trader setup, multiple monitors, and a lot of data being observed. Next slide. This is the data that they look at, and there will be price charts, et cetera. And then in the upper right, it's hard to see, but that looks like the order book. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but all you see are contract order sizes and prices. You don't see names associated with that. You don't know whether that person is a cattle producer or a processor or a speculator or a bank or anything, or a hedge fund or anything like that. You just see numbers of contracts and prices traded. And as we'll get into, while that can be a maybe there are some virtues to that or benefits to that, but the anonymity, I think, has led to more gamesmanship in the futures industry. Next slide. Okay, focusing on live cattle futures, it historically was one of the CME flagship products. It's governed by CME Rulebook Chapter 101. One contract calls for the delivery of 40,000 pounds of cattle. It's priced in cents per pound, very sensitive price fluctuations. The minimum is 0.00025 per pound, or $10 per contract. So, when you're considering 40,000 pounds of cattle, and that price can move by as little as 10 pounds per contract, it's designed for maximum price efficiency. There are set delivery months: February, April, June, August, October, and December. And the cattle futures contract, unlike some other contracts, generally require physical delivery. I said at CBOT approved delivery locations, I meant CME. At approved locations. The only way you can get out of that delivery obligation is by offsetting your contract. So if you committed to make delivery by selling a futures contract, you have to, and you don't want to make delivery, you don't have cattle or the certificates reflecting cattle, you have to sell an offsetting contract. So if you have a February, if you sold the February contract, you have to buy an offsetting February contract. You can't offset by buying an April contract if you sold a February. And then down below, I just pulled out a blurb from the rule book on the grade. And you all are far more familiar with the various grades than I, but they are fairly specific. And of course, there is some variance and some ability to deliver cattle that might, that barely meets or falls in the middle of these standards. Okay, next slide. Just reiterating, everything is carefully defined and specified. The goal of the CME is to have standardized contracts and not have parties disputing the type of cattle that was delivered to them, because then the efficiency of the market would decrease. Next slide. What's the purpose of cattle futures? You know better than I that it's, for a producer and to a certain extent for a processor, it's for hedging purposes. If one wants to lock in a price that they think is good, they can sell futures contracts and then, take care of the delivery later, or fluctuate their holdings so that they're constantly hedging a good price. And then the other purpose is speculation. A lot of investors who have nothing to do with actually growing cattle or processing it or transporting it or anything will think they have a view of the cattle futures market or the cattle market generally, and they may take out speculative positions on that. There are pros and cons. In the last several years, there have been wild price swings that have been attributed to speculation. That's led many to, describe the cattle futures market as the meat casino and things like that. In the truest sense, speculation can be good because you have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people with their own informed view coming into the market, and there's one consolidated price established from all of those competing views. If it works well, it can be very efficient in discovering the appropriate price. If it gets lopsided, then it can have disastrous consequences. Next slide. Okay, who are the players in the commodities markets? Investors are the end users of the futures and options contracts. They may be hedging, they may be speculating. They may get introduced to the market, or they may have access to the market through what's called an introducing broker. And then there are firms called order placement agents. If somebody wants to parse out their purchases or sales and not do it all at once, or if they are going to be away from their trading monitor, away from the phone, they might use an order placement agent to make their orders over time. or over the course of an evening. And then the other, after investors, the introducing brokers and order placement agents are not necessary. An investor can go straight to the futures commission merchants. And those are, in the commodities markets, are like broker dealers in the securities markets. Futures commissions merchants are have privileges with the CME. They are heavily regulated by the CME. They keep track of everybody's orders and everybody's trades. They're the ones who send the statements out to figure out where the balances are and what the positions are. And then finally, we have the exchanges, such as the CME. Next slide. Okay, types of investors in cattle markets: producers, ranchers, and feedlots. And then the rest are just a range of entities. The most notable are processors, packers, and food companies, investment funds, hedge funds, speculators, locals, day traders, long-term traders, arbitrageurs, algorithmic traders, and high-frequency traders. So there's a real centralization of different trader types, different personality types, and I depicted that by, we have a rancher in the upper left and Gordon Gekko in the lower right. Next slide. Risk management is key, and of course there's risk management from the producer perspective. They're managing risk by hedging, perhaps. In this sense, on this slide, what I'm talking about is risk management from the financial market sense. The exchange does not want defaults on obligations by FCMs. The FCM must meet net capital requirements. They always have to have cash on reserve. And customer funds have to be separated from FCM funds. At least they should be. Some of you may be familiar with MF Global's collapse. MF Global was a huge FCM. They made some proprietary bets on European bonds. And when those bets went the wrong way, they rated their customers' money and used that to satisfy shortfalls before going down. The customer money was locked up for several years. There was litigation over it, and it cost a lot of families and traders a tremendous amount of financial and personal hardship. It was very important in selecting an FCM to have one that does things right, not unlike your 401k or SEP IRA or anything like that, because sometimes folks at those FCM funds, when they're playing with other people's money, just assume it's their money, and it can be a tricky situation. FCMs do not want defaults on obligations by customers because that puts them cross with the exchange. So they have financial requirements for customers. They might have just background, wealth, and asset requirements. And then during the life of a position, they'll require their customers to post margin if the futures price moves in a direction against the customer. Next slide. Okay, in 1936, Congress passed the Commodity Exchange Act. It was the third or fourth attempt to bring some type of regulation to this market. It was, relatively close to the great market crash of 1929. There was a lot Congress was doing to reform the financial markets. It replaced the Grain Futures Act, which had proven unworkable. The agricultural farmers primarily were concerned with price depression at that time, and market participants generally were concerned with fraud. And so the purpose of the Commodity Exchange Act was to bring some normalcy and predictability to the futures markets. It has several provisions. It's really long, but the key ones are no fraud, no manipulation, futures trade on an exchange, and there will be regulation by the CFTC. Next slide. Okay, now we're getting into the meat of the presentation. What is manipulation? And here we have some graphical pictures where there's a hand moving the price. It's a single trader, trading firm moving the price. There's no one-size-fits-all definition. The courts, including in a case against Cargill back in the 1950s, said that the methods of manipulation are limited only by the ingenuity of man. You can't define manipulation with specificity because, to enumerate too many characteristics is to eliminate other things that are likely manipulation, particularly as the products evolve and the markets evolve. An important point is that the Commodity Exchange Act outlaws manipulation of not only futures contracts, but also the price of the underlying commodity. So in our situation, and we'll get into this later, even if the big four, our defendants in the case, did not intend or did not have the futures price as their goal of manipulation, we've alleged that they manipulated the underlying commodity, physical cattle. That is enough to make them liable under the Commodity Exchange Act. We don't need to tie their conduct to the futures market or their objective to the futures market. We can represent futures traders who say the futures price was impacted intentionally, purposefully, knowingly, or otherwise by the manipulation of the underlying commodity. Next slide. There are many types of manipulation, and I think this will be helpful, not only for current purposes, but as you observe the markets going forward, to keep an eye out for things that you might think are manipulation. A lot of times, and it's happened with a lot of my clients, there's been a sudden price movement or a price that just doesn't make sense, and they can't understand why. And then 3, 5, 7, 10 years later, the regulator comes out with some type of news indicating that there was manipulation way back when. And my clients then come to me and say, oh, okay, this is what happened. And I've had clients who lost everything because of manipulation, not knowing why, knowing something was up, but they didn't know what it was. And so it's important to keep the various types in mind. The most common, first bullet point, are corners and squeezes. Then we have benchmark manipulation, false signal manipulation, spoofing, false rumors, banging the close, and so on. Next slide. Okay, corners and squeezes that's used interchangeably. No one agrees on what each of those terms mean, but the gist of it is that a dominant player will gobble up the supply of a commodity, and then they will acquire a long position in the futures contract. As the contract matures towards expiration, prices will rise, the shorts will panic, and if they want to make delivery, they have to go to the dominant player. If they want to cover their short position, they have to buy futures contracts at an artificial price that was caused by the dominant player. So either way, they have to buy at an artificial price, usually to the direct benefit of the dominant player. And a big example of that was the 1989 Ferruzzi soybean squeeze. Next slide. Then we have benchmark manipulation. A lot of futures contracts, cattle's not one of them, are tied to benchmarks that are set by industry. So what could go wrong when the consolidated industry dominators set the prices of the benchmark that the futures contracts settle? Well, an example would be LIBOR. Eurodollar futures settle to the price of LIBOR, which is the London Interbank Offered Rate. There were 16 banks that set LIBOR, so they literally set the settlement price of the futures contracts. They could go into the futures market, establish a position, and then set the benchmark. And they got busted for colluding in and around 2011, or leading up to 2011, and they broke the whole LIBOR system apart because of it. Next slide. Then we have false signal manipulation. Apologies, the slide's harder to read than I had anticipated, but the gist of a false signal manipulation is that the manipulator wants to send a signal to the market, usually at around the time of expiration of a futures contract, that there is outsized supply or outsized demand, depending on which view they take, for the underlying commodity. It's similar to a squeeze or corner, except they don't have to dominate or get a huge position in the futures contract. An example would be Lansing Trade Group, which is an agricultural concern. They focus primarily on grains. They, at the time of expiration, they had acquired long positions in futures contracts, particularly the expiring contract, and then calendar spread positions that would profit if the nearer term contracts rose relative to the further term contracts. And in the days leading up to the near term contract expiration, they canceled shipping certificates, which signified that they or somebody needed a large quantity of wheat. And they sent rail cars to the grain elevator in Chicago, and the market panicked and prices rose, and they were able to profit from that. What made it a false signal is, as alleged by the CFTC and the CME, they didn't really need the wheat. They were only doing it to send that signal that there was a need for the wheat. Next slide. Spoofing has been in the news lately, and this is a creature of anonymous trading. So what can go wrong if everyone is hidden behind a computer and all the trading is anonymous? Well, spoofing is what can go wrong. Spoofing, elementary definition, is when a trader enters an order with the intent to cancel it. They're entering it with the intent to move prices, and then they're going to cancel it as soon as prices move. Next slide. The key characteristics, it has to be an electronic trading environment. You couldn't spoof in the old open outcrypt days, because if you flashed your hands and then disappeared that signal with your hands, the other traders in the pit just wouldn't take you seriously. The two features are the genuine order, that's the order that the trader wants filled, and the spoof order, that's the order or orders that the trader's using to dislocate prices. Next slide. Okay, so let's assume a spoofer wants to buy at $6, but nobody will sell there, and the closest offer to sell is at $7. She may enter 100 orders to sell at 9 and 100 orders to sell at 10, away from the market, the inside market. Nobody's going to trade there, but it's going to make the market think that there are a bunch of sellers. This will sell that $7 seller down $1 to the $6, where our spoofer wants to buy at. So the spoofer's $6 buy order is filled, and the spoofer cancels the 100 lot sell orders. Next slide. Oh, you know what? It's okay. It looks like one of the charts got missing. So can you go back one slide? Okay. So the key here is, as I mentioned previously, all of the electronic trading environment is simply contract numbers, the number of contracts being ordered, and the prices that the traders are willing to pay. It moves rapidly and dynamically. So if I'm a seller at 7 and I have a need to sell, but I don't really want to move down to 6, I'm holding out for 7, and I see hundreds of orders come just above me, I get panicked. I think that maybe those hundreds of orders, whoever's behind them, are going to drop their price and sell to the nearest buyer. So I'm going to panic, and my $7 offer to sell is, I'm going to move to a $6 offer to sell. And then that's how the spoofing works. And then I see that the 100 lot orders just disappear. And I may realize they were fake. They may be mixed in with other legitimate orders, but it upsets the order book. Next slide. Okay, this is just a recap, and the key here is that because manipulation is limited only by the ingenuity of man, manipulation can encompass all of the foregoing. It can take bits and pieces and borrow from it. So there's no one pattern to look out for. Regulators and private attorneys like myself, we look out for characteristics and bits and pieces and try to put them together and see if it was manipulation. Next slide. Okay. The black letter law, legal elements of manipulation. Black letter law is just something that everyone agrees upon across courts, across lawyers, et cetera. The 4 elements of manipulation under the Commodity Exchange Act are: number 1, an intent to manipulate; number 2, the ability to manipulate; number 3, an artificial price; and number 4, causation. And then, of course, to recover as a private litigant, you have to prove that you were damaged. Next slide. Okay, so what is an artificial price? It's a price that does not reflect the true forces of supply and demand. Supply and demand can be a lot of things. It can be the quantity of a stock available. It can be traders' views on what that commodity is worth. It can be traders' views on as affected by everything going on in the world, whether global, the physical market, or the futures market. When I'm looking at agricultural or livestock products, particularly in a tight time frame, separate from a multi-year time frame, I'm looking at things like weather, political events, import rules, whether there's new players entering the market, significant players leaving the market, plants being shuttered, financial crisis that might be impacting liquidity and thus might force people out of position so that they can get cash on hand, and even random things, or not random, but like across the world things like a currency defaulting, or South Korea increasing its nuclear capabilities and that impacting the financial markets. We'll get into it in a little bit, but economists can generally tease out factors that did not impact the price by selecting a proper set of control variables. I think a recent example of supply and demand, and folks can probably have different views on whether this legitimately affected supply and demand, would be a fire at a cattle processing facility that might impact upcoming purchases. Next slide. Intent. The key element is the intent to cause artificial prices. We can't go inside people's brains and figure out, at least before discovery, what they were thinking. So we have to use circumstantial evidence. Why would a significant market player take that position? Could it be for something other than manipulation? Recklessness, it's generally accepted that recklessness suffices. It's generally accepted that individuals are presumed to intend the natural consequences of their actions. Now, there is a split in the courts over this, but for our purposes, if somebody is doing something that they know or should know will impact prices, that should suffice to satisfy the intent to manipulate element of a Commodity Exchange Act manipulation claim. Next slide. Okay, ability to manipulate. That's usually the easiest element to prove. The manipulator has the financial wherewithal, they have access to the market, and they engaged in conduct that can be that logically is sufficient to dislocate prices. A single trader trading a single contract. Let's say a single trader buys a cattle futures contract, and prices jump up, 5% that day, and there were hundreds of thousands of contracts traded. Well, it would be easy for that trader to say, my single contract purchase did not move prices. But if that single trader occupied 50% of the market, then the ability element would be satisfied. Next slide. Causation. We have to prove that the manipulator's conduct caused the observed price artificiality, and that movements can't be explained by other market factors. So we have to take into account things like interest rates or what's going on more broadly in the agriculture and livestock market. And we employ economists to do those studies and help us with that. Next slide. Economic modeling. is critical in these cases. And much of the fight, once we get by the pleading stage, is over whether our experts did the right type of event study or regression to isolate the price movements to establish both artificiality and causation. And within an event study, there are thousands of little choices that need to be made that the experts battle over, and that the court has to decide whether whether the plaintiff's expert, for example, used scientific principles and was and applied them reasonably to the case at hand. Experts can disagree over choices, but they have to be based in science. Next slide. Okay, regulatory action, and the chief regulators for commodities futures, including cattle futures, are the CFTC, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the Department of Justice, who will look at a broader range of conduct not tied to the futures markets, but if the conduct is sufficient enough, criminally culpable enough, then they will go after bad actors. And then the CME group does a fair amount of policing. They have a market regulation division that keeps an eye on trading, and that goes after people for bad acts. Next slide. These are just examples of regulatory action in the fairly recent past. The CFTC has gone after the LIBOR banks, Lansing, and other agricultural companies. The CME has gone after Lansing, the Andersons, and Cargill for wheat conduct. And the Department of Justice recently has taken an interest in spoofing in financial products and precious metal products. Ways regulatory action are initiated, and this is where market participants such as yourselves are very important. Well, the CFTC conducts field exams. They might discover something on their own. The exchange might observe something and launch an investigation. But the most common way is tips from market participants or insiders to the manipulation. Market participants can be outsiders to the manipulation and report something. Next slide. The new paradigm is whistleblowing. Most of you are aware that the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, famously dropped the ball on prosecuting Bernie Madoff. There was a whistleblower who sent them a ton of information indicating he was running a Ponzi scheme. It didn't go anywhere within the SEC, and at least temporarily, thousands of people lost tens of millions of dollars. And as a part of Dodd-Frank, the Congress authorized or required the CFTC and the SEC to establish whistleblower programs. It's a formalized program where they receive tips from the public generally, and then they have to process those tips. Next slide. Whistleblowing begins with the Form TCR, and that's a specific form that they require folks to fill out. Forms can be submitted anonymously. They can be submitted by the individual or through an attorney. And it's important to be very specific and to have some original information. It's not a good idea just to send a Wall Street Journal article and say, here, investigate this. Something more needs to be done. Next slide. After a Form TCR is filed, the CFTC may reach out. They may want to meet with you or your attorneys and get more information. They may ask for documents and have conference calls, and their investigations generally take years. They'll never tell you where they're at with their investigation. They'll only get information from you. It's a one-way street. Next slide. If they do pursue and recover more than $1 million, then the tipper, the original tipper, may be entitled to a bounty. Next slide. It's important to keep an eye out if you do submit a tip for the CFTC's regulatory actions and notices of covered action. There's time limits associated with collecting your bounty or applying for your bounty. You can be 10 to 30% depending on the quality of your information. So if the CFTC recovers $1 million, then the minimum would be $100,000 and the maximum would be $300,000. Tipper has to explain the contribution to the investigation to recover the bounty. Next slide. Okay, cattle antitrust litigation and the role of futures. Our core theory, as alleged in our complaint, including our amended complaint, is that by manipulating the underlying cash cattle markets, the Big Four manipulated futures prices. On top of that, the Big Four also, and the manipulation I'm talking about is the persistent suppression that we've seen below where prices should be, according to most market participants and our economists. On top of that, the Big Four also appear to have had a large short position throughout the relevant period. The question comes to mind: why are they shorting if they are buyers of futures? Why are they shorting futures contracts? If they're buyers, they'd want to lock in prices to manage their risk, and they'd lock in future purchase prices by buying now, being buyers of futures contracts, but they're not. They appear to be sellers of futures contracts. One consequence of that is that by having this large short position in the market, they would be suppressing futures prices, which then are referred to in establishing physical market prices, including in the cash market and in the forward and formula contracts. It's also important to note the Big Four control all of the CME approved slaughter or delivery facilities. There's no non-Big Four entity that owns a CME approved slaughter facility. So they have a unique insight into delivery dynamics and what's going on come delivery time. The price link between cash cattle and live cattle futures is indisputable. And it's our position more broadly, outside of trying to recover money, that the cash and futures markets need to be more transparent, and they need to be rectified so that true price discovery can occur. The futures market should act on it as a check on the cash and physical market, and the cash and physical market should act as a check on the futures market. And that's just not happening there, or not happening here. Next slide. Okay. Eric indicated we may not have time for questions, but I'm happy to entertain them if folks have them. And I just want to thank RCAP for the opportunity to present here. And if folks have questions, Bill and others at RCAP have my contact information, and you should feel free to reach out. Thank you.